The Whitechapel Murders in Media: How Public Panic Led to Social Awareness and Reform. Nora Kennedy, April 16, 2013. What makes Jack the Ripper such a widely discussed topic even a century later? The Whitechapel murders were a horrific event at the end of the 19th century, but since then history has shown humanity is capable of more terrible and disturbing crimes. Why does Jack the Ripper stand out among the worst humanity has to offer? Culture is a simple answer, but a more accurate explanation would be media. Many social changes have occurred in the past century, but Western's cultures, paranoia, and obsession with the current events has only intensified with quicker and newer technology. Media and literature have constantly shaped cultural opinions and motivated reform. The Ripper murders were horrible crimes, but the consequences of the murders changed social attitudes towards the poor and degraded inner-city population. Instead of being the problem in society, the poverty area of Whitechapel was finally viewed as a victim. Jack the Ripper did not give birth to the 20th century, but his actions led to the social reform that moved England into the modern era. By exploring the Victorian moral panics in England, it is easier to understand what the Ripper murders accomplished and how they left a legacy in pop culture. Media hype of human monsters was a normal aspect of England and started almost 200 years before Jack the Ripper was spidered across headlines. In 1712, the Mohawk Club became a popular target for journalists after a rumor spread throughout London concerning a gang of savages that roamed the streets of the capital harassing innocent individuals. It was said they'd slit people's noses, tumbled old women down the hills in barrels, and overturned carriages using fishing lines and tied ropes to the feet of women, suspended them upside down, and did them unspeakable mischief. These rumors created panic and fear in the population, causing many to avoid going out at night. Some people speculated that this gossip was a tactic used by the overprotective husbands wanting to keep their wives in the fear of the outside world. Ultimately, the rumors stopped after multiple statements given by the police regarding the lower city crime activity, and no convictions were made for these crimes. Although there was barely any evidence of these acts actually occurring, people fed off of the news and eventually caused harsher law enforcement that put an end to the rumors. Similar to the Mohawk Club, the London Monster gained attention from the public after multiple encounters were written in 1788, creating more hysteria in England. Newspapers wrote about a series of attacks from a man who would curse at a lady and cut her with a knife right above her knee. A new terror initiated. Many women came forward to the police and claimed that they had been victim of the London Monster to gain sympathy, but the majority was fraud. It became difficult for a man to walk down the street alone without being accused and attacked by a group of citizens on patrol for the London Monster. London soon became unsafe for men to walk the streets alone out of fear they would be suspect and attacked by civilians or police. Eventually, Renwick Williams was convicted of the offense on June 14, 1790, but many speculate on the likelihood of him actually committing the crimes as he was an artificial flower maker. Nevertheless, the man was sentenced to 6 years in Newgate Prison, and the media had to wait for the next night horror. The garroting scares filled the crime news hole in 1856 after a new style of robbery was reported in London. It was reinitiated in 1862 when MP Hugh Pilkington was garroted on his walk from the House of Commons to the Reform Club. Since the new victim were males and respectable citizens, the media demanded harsh police enforcement and punishment for these crimes. Again, it became difficult for men to venture out at night out of fear they might be a suspect of garroting an individual. Although street violence had actually slowed down because of the media attention, the Metropolitan Police were still condemned by the public for not doing enough to stop these criminals. The mass hysteria among Londoners continued and brought together groups of vigilantes that felt obligated to bring justice and developed a community of people demanding public safety. Media continued to feed the population with old stories until the East End was threatened by Jack the Ripper, the first documented serial killer in England, which brought the focus of London's attention to Whitechapel. Whitechapel is located in East End, London, and at the turn of the 19th century was the poster child for British immorality. Due to the extreme poverty in Whitechapel district, social issues like corruption, prostitution, and racism were ignored. Whitechapel had the highest poverty rate out of any English district, with 47% that lived below the poverty line. With a population of 90,000, that meant 42,300 people were either underemployed or unemployed. People in the district barely had enough food to live, and the West End of London considered the area a slum. The significant contribution to the poverty rate was that Whitechapel did not support itself through factory capitalism like the neighboring districts, instead relying on a service industry. Service was what Whitechapel became notorious for, especially when prostitution became a popular occupation for women in England. Impurity in England centered in Victorian London, where there was an epidemic of women prostitutes in the late 1800s. Quote, The Lancet estimated that 1 house in every 60 in London was a brothel, and 1 female in every 16, of all ages, was a whore. On this basis, there would have been more than 6,000 brothels in London and about 80,000 prostitutes. In the Whitechapel district, prostitution was such a problem that even married women would go out and sell their bodies to survive. In October of 1888, even at the high point of the Ripper Scare, it was reported that there were around 1,200 prostitutes and 62 brothels in the district. With the high poverty rates and economic depression in England during the time, it was easy for women to be tempted by the quick money. Although legislation and social groups attempted to regulate these degraded women, many of the reforms failed or were repelled. Literature and dramas were produced around the social issues that provided explanations for the causes of prostitution and a new view on the morality of a prostitute. By underlining the economic causes of prostitution, the text reinforced the dangers of working-class female sexuality and the need for its regulation, showing how the philanthropic project of reclaiming fallen women was linked to the repression of the new women. Like media, these stories manipulated public opinion and created portions of the population who sympathized with the prostitute's situation, and some excused the acts as a sexual liberty for women. This hindered the societal purification movement, and as the prostitute's population rose, so did disease. Although the definition of disease has changed significantly since the Victorian period, it is clear that Jack the Ripper's district had an unhealthy population. Most of the population had poor health from factory working condition, poor diets, and environmental issues. Alcoholism was a common issue among men and women in England, causing physical and mental problems. Since there was a substantial population of prostitutes, venereal disease was a common threat. Parliament attempted to reform this issue through the Contagious Disease Acts that allowed police to, quote, apprehend women of doubtful virtue in the streets and insist they be medically examined. If found to be diseased, they could be detained and locked in hospitals. These acts were repealed in 1860, and the continued spread of syphilis in London grew as more men and women participated in the prostitution ring. Metropolitan police attempted to patrol the streets to reprehend these immoral acts, but there was a limit to their authority and ability. As cities began to overpopulate during the industrial period in England, legislation regarding police protection was updated to compensate. In all of the social panics in London, the police were blamed and ridiculed for their lack of conviction and investigation by the media. In almost every case, the accusations made against the departments were false, and the media attention actually caused negative consequences that corrupted the investigation. Prior to this period, the perception of detectives and police were not as important as maintaining order, but it drastically changed in the Victorian period. Given that the Metropolitan Police, unlike other police forces in the country, operated under the district authority of the Home Office, its employees were seen as agents of the state. Hence, their image was relevant to the stability of the established order as a whole. Investigations and suspects needed to be handled differently in the East End, and that led detectives to limit information to the public. Criminal punishment needed to be monitored to reflect positively on justice of the peace. Due to the unethical hierarchy in some areas, documented information of crimes and deaths is unreliable and have manipulated historical data. Popular fiction regarding the district of Whitechapel in the late 1800s often indicates that murder was particularly rare during the reign of terror brought by Jack the Ripper. Quote, the sanitary conditions of Whitechapel listed no murders in the Whitechapel area in the years 1886 and 1887. The report listed only 71 cases of violent death in 1887, 69 of those deaths were attributed to accidents, and the remaining 2 were suicides. Officially, these accounts suggest that murder was a rarity in Whitechapel, but further exploration shows that there was more improper record-keeping. In the late 1880s and early 1900s, London's coroners were employed and paid by the Justice of the Peace for their reports on deaths. They were typically not requested to perform further investigation on violent deaths because they were considered unnecessary. It was not until 1926 that they even needed a medical background before being employed as a coroner. This district was known as a high-crime area, but countless offenses were either not reported or inaccurately documented. It is apparent through this analysis that the crime of murder was not a contributing factor that made Jack the Ripper a legend. On August 31, 1888, the Autumn Scare in London started when police discovered Jack the Ripper's first victim. Mary Ann Nichols was found in a secluded yard with her throat slashed from ear to ear. Quote, the abdomen had been jaggedly cut open from the center of the bottom of the ribs along the right side under her pelvis and to the left of her stomach. The coating of the stomach was cut in several places. No viscera were missing. There were 2 stab wounds in her private areas, and the coroner believed that the abdominal injuries were inflicted first and caused instantaneous death. Nichols, like the other victims, had been brutally murdered and left on display for the public to find. Depending on the historian or detective question, the number of Ripper victims varies from 5 to 11 or even more. Most observers would agree that at least 5 women were the unfortunate victims of Whitechapel murders, each more gruesome than the last. The Whitechapel murder spree started in August and ended in November of 1888 with the final victim, Mary Kelly. With each murder, the crimes escalated and became more brutal and generated terror in the public. Kelly's scene was the final shock to the public left by Jack the Ripper, and that is also the most notable. On Friday, November 9th, she was found inside a room where, quote, the surfaces of her abdomen and of her thighs were removed, and her abdominal cavity had been emptied of viscera. The uterus and kidneys were found, along with 1 breast, under her head. Her other breast was found by her right foot, and her liver between her feet. Her intestines were placed by her right side, and her spleen was placed on the left side of her body. These flaps removed from her abdomen and thighs were found on the table. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition, and her neck was severed to the bone. Further examination revealed that the pericardium had been opened and her heart had been removed. Close quote. Additional mutilation had occurred, making the scene almost unbearable to investigate. Kelly's death was the incredibly graphic and exposed multiple characteristics, modus operandi, and personal signature. Jack the Ripper had a distinct modus operandi because his murder choices displayed similar traits. All of the victims were alleged prostitutes, which were not uncommon for the district and were more heavily intoxicated the night of their murder. Quote, the victims, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly all had their throats cut and following their death were all, with the exception of Elizabeth Stride's, where the murder is postulated to have been interrupted, eviscerated with a brutality that becomes more extreme with each victim, close quote. All of the victims were women who were from the same area, and their murders were committed within a 1-mile radius. Each murder was committed in the dark between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning, usually on a weekend. With the exclusion of Kelly, who was 24 and killed indoors, the other women were all around the same age of 43 to 46, and all murdered outdoors. They were all working-class women who were poor and lived in a poor district. Similar to the choice of victims, the killer also had a crime signature. One of the reasons Jack the Ripper is infamous a century later is because of the specific behaviors exposed from the crimes. By examining all of the crime scenes, a signature analysis of the Whitechapel murders can be developed. First, it is the sexual aspect of the murders that was each victim received inflictions to the breast or genital area. The killer needed to have complete control over his victim and force them into submission. Second, all of the murders had the signature of overkill and mutilation of the victims caused during the murder and after the death, especially in the case of Kelly. Third was the staging of scenes, where the bodies were left in the open for the victims to be found in a specific pose. Finally, the most significant trait was that these murders were clearly planned by Jack the Ripper. The crimes committed were all thoroughly calculated by the killer and organized in a way that had not been demonstrated previously by a murderer. Jack the Ripper's criminal acts were not only new for Victorian England, but also extremely rare in the modern era. The police did not have the tools or knowledge to properly investigate these crimes in 1888, which caused false accusations, vigilantes, lost evidence, and poor public relations. Public relations from Jack the Ripper's murders received similar results to the previous moral panics in London. Media fueled the public fear through plastering newspaper advertising posters throughout Whitechapel providing detailed descriptions of the horrific murder scenes, and the attention increased further after the police and news media started to receive letters and other messages signed by Jack the Ripper. These messages contained negative criticism of the investigation, details regarding the murders, and references to future victims. One of the most famous letters, known as From Hell, contained a kidney that was supposedly from the last victim. The package was sent to George Lusk, a vigilance leader, on October 15, 1888, titled From Hell. None of the messages could prove authenticity, and many believed that they were sent by various journalists to generate more news of the murders. News media was highly impacted by the murderer's popularity. A new style of journalism was developed by the London press, in which dramatic angles were used to develop a story and retain the reader's attention. Even after the murders became irrelevant, journalists continued to use the new style, which gained respect by the public. Published articles regarding the murder influenced public opinion of the crimes and directed police work with the investigation. As the case of Jack the Ripper gained public interest, pressure was put on the Metropolitan Police to find the culprit. Quote, the victims had their throats slashed and their bodies mutilated in ways that revealed substantial physiological knowledge, perhaps medical training. Panic ensued, and the inability of the police to stop the crimes, coupled with the authorities' receipt of taunting letters signed Jack the Ripper, brought on a scandal. At the time, police training did not equip them with the necessary skills or technology to perform an in-depth investigation of a killer like Jack the Ripper. The police were using any resource available, including consulting psychics for help. One of the main issues when gathering the information and determining suspects was the time wasted from people accusing others of the crime and false confessions. Letters for the public were sent to the police and newspapers offering suggestions on how to find the murderer. Public panic caused the streets to be unsafe for men due to the possibility of being accused by a passerby. Racism became a serious problem when considering suspects, and many of the upper-level investigations blamed immigrants. Racism is a common attribute of the English, especially towards immigrants like the Jewish Eastern Europeans and Irish. England had recently had a large amount of Irish immigrants move into the city after the potato famine between 1845 and 1852. There had been hostility towards them and a social view that the Irish were all lower-class workers, destroying the British economy. Jews were also a victim of discrimination in England. Several of the prime suspects in the murders were Jews, not surprising, given that anti-Semitism was ingrained in British society, that the Whitechapel district was inhabited mostly by poor immigrants, many of them Jews, and that immigrant unrest was a central concern of law enforcement during this period." Close quote. During the time of the murders, police and citizens both agreed the killer must have been a foreigner because the brutality of the murders are not a reflection of English culture. Understanding that these murders would create an anti-Semitic outrage, the Metropolitan Police advised Jews of the East End to stay away from the murder scenes. On September 30th, 1888, when, quote, "the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was written above the wall above Catherine Eddowes' murder scene, the Jewish community became a bigger target for public suspicion and harassment. Metropolitan Police had to remove the evidence of the writing in order to avoid anti-Semitic rioting in Whitechapel. The phrase generated a large amount of controversy in regards to the meaning of the graffiti. Depending on how it is read, it can either mean that the Jews are to blame or that they are innocent, and others believe that it is a code word for the Freemasons. Overall, it bred more distrust towards Whitechapel's Jewish population and urged citizens to do their own investigation. Vigilantes and amateur detectives started to gain popularity in 1887 after the publication of Sherlock Holmes. The crimes in Whitechapel enticed citizens to adopt the investigative skills they read about into action. Even before the release of Sherlock Holmes' adventures, the British had always formed a community bond during a moral crisis. For the police in the district, this meant they would be forced to control the population from becoming judge, jury, and executioner. The Whitechapel murders reports public criticism of the London police and the resultant organization of vigilante communities, disregarding the fact that they were limited powers and at the disposal of the police force. One group that gained a lot of recognition during this time was the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. On September 10, 1888, the committee formed, headed by George Lusk, with the mission to patrol the area of Whitechapel in order to protect the district's reputation and commerce. At the end of September, the committee members wrote the government that they requested a reward offered for anyone who can provide information about the crimes. When their request was denied, they decided to offer a reward, which caused more people to become actively involved in the investigation. Happy with the amount of protection provided by the police, the wealthy members gathered resources and paid wages to unemployed men to patrol the streets at night. After the final murder of Mary Kelly, police and vigilantes were desperate to find the killer, but Jack the Ripper was never caught. Over the past century, many have reopened the investigation to determine who was the Whitechapel murderer. With the public knowledge provided, no one can provide a suspect without flaws, but that is not the only legacy left by Jack the Ripper. These murders focused media attention on the poor and degraded East End that had been ignored by England. For the first time, England finally saw impure women as victims and wanted to help their conditions. Social reform started to gain support, and philanthropic men and women helped rebuild Whitechapel. In 1890, Parliament passed reforms to sanitize the district of Whitechapel and other slum areas in England. Efforts to help improve English poverty continued with the help of both government and citizens. William and Catherine Booth were philanthropists who helped improve the Whitechapel district by founding the Salvation Army in 1865. Quote, "The Booths were Methodists who were also deeply influenced by the holiness movement and wished to follow the path of revivalists like James Coffey and Charles Finney." Catherine Booth first came to prominence in 1859 when she published a pamphlet defending women's ministry. She soon established an independent career that took her to chapels and halls throughout Britain. In 1865, they established a home mission known as the Christian Mission in London's East End. After the Ripper murders, organizations like the Salvation Army started to emerge in England. With the ongoing effort for Parliament to meet the demand for reform in London, they amended the Public Health Act of 1890. This law, first introduced in 1848, was created with the mission to improve the sanitary conditions throughout England. Improvements to legislation continue to be made along with other reforms to help the poverty in towns and cities. In 1890, Parliament passed the Housing of Working Class Citizens Act to encourage further restoration of poverty areas. This act is an extension of the Artisans Act of 1875, which allows authorities to purchase and redevelop poor areas. Richard Cross, the Home Secretary during the period when Benjamin Disraeli was Prime Minister, designed the act. Housing and Working Class Act greatly increases the loans given to those authorities, allowing the project to become more realistic. Terms of the act include owners must be provided compensation, interest rates provided by the government loans were lower than normal, and the area must be redeveloped for commercial builders. Although not everyone agreed with the act, claiming it was a violation of property rights, the legislation was successful. Through the resources provided by this legislation, the East End was able to be rebuilt over time. Jack the Ripper left a legacy of social reform and suspicion driven by media hype and public panic. Social issues of racism between locals and immigrants became more noticeable, causing anti-Semitic outrage and speculation. Ripperologists continue to speculate about the investigation and debate a long list of suspects. Publications, dramas, and pop culture references portraying the events are easy to find in the 21st century. At the time, media was eager to interest the London audience, and they created a legend. In the process of making the Ripper brand, journalists also exposed the difficulties in the East End of London, which included crime, racism, disease, and real poverty. The women who had the unfortunate fate of being murdered by Jack the Ripper become victims instead of diseased prostitutes. The killings created a community in London with the mission to protect the streets from these horrible crimes. A culprit was not convicted for the crimes, but legal and social change was implemented to avoid a recurrence of this murder spree. Overall, Jack the Ripper's actions showed the best and worst attitudes of England, which later encouraged community and reform.